So, I was thinking back to when I made that video about the beast class, and how I collected data on heroic spirits with demonic beast traits who could take on Koyanskaya. Now recently, that thought popped back into my head, and I started getting curious about the bigger picture of these heroic spirits, specifically the ones with animal traits. Naturally, I ended up looking more into this category of servants. And well, the whole animal characteristic thing feels kinda odd. Not in general, but more about who gets included in this category and why. If you've seen my video from a while back, you'll know I tried to make sense of the 5-star rarity system, which, let's be real, only exists because the devs wanted to cash in on their favorite servants. This time though, I want to dive into these traits and see if there's any logic behind it, or if there isn't, maybe I'll just end up ranting about how none of it makes sense. Now, I did a quick search online and found out that the term animal trait servants in Fate Grand Order refers to characters with animal-like features or abilities, whether it's part of their design or their lore. These traits help make them stand out in the game's roster. What's interesting though is how flexible this animal characteristic thing can be. For example, even something like a bunny suit with bunny ears qualifies as an animal trait. You'd think that'd be pretty straightforward, but honestly, some of the choices for who gets this trait and who doesn't are just confusing. Let's start by talking about bunny ears. As I mentioned earlier, even removable bunny ears are considered part of the animal characteristic trait. Some servants who didn't originally have this trait end up getting it because they wear costumes you can buy from Da Vinci's shop. And it's not something tied to their origin, like Artoria Ruler, who has bunny ears as part of her spirit origin thanks to the bunny suit. If you summon her, she automatically has the trait, because her spirit origin includes the bunny ears. How that works exactly, I have no idea. The point is, bunny ears on outfits count as an animal characteristic, and, well, in Artoria's case that kinda makes sense. She got summoned with that outfit, that bunny ears. It's animal-like, even if it's just part of their clothing. But those who are only wearing costumes also end up being classified under the animal characteristic trait, and that's kinda weird. Remember, it's just a costume, a piece of clothing made from fabric. Well, let's just assume that the costumes we buy from Da Vinci's shop or Miss Crane are somehow made of magical energy, and this magical energy can influence a heroic spirit's traits. Yeah, let's just think of it that way. But if we're talking about artificial magic-made bunny ears, what about characters who actually have real animal ears? Take Canis, for example. From what I've read, the ears on top of her head are real. Some say they're bunny ears, while others think they're horse ears. Well, I'm leaning toward horse ears though, since in one version of her myth, she's the daughter of Hippia, the goddess of horses, and we know how different versions of myths can influence a hero's traits, especially if they're well known. Either way, she clearly has animal characteristics. So, here's the question. Why doesn't Canis have the animal characteristic trait? You know what, I'll just dump it here for the other examples. If you farms a lot, you've probably been using Nitocris for that. Now notice that Nitocris has animal-like ears on her head. But she's not classified under the animal characteristic trait either. Weird, right? Oh, and let's not forget Queen of Sheba. She's got animal ears too, but she's also not included in the category. What's up with that? So, this is where I, as usual, start cooking out some theories. Of course, you're free to share your own thoughts and theories in the comments too. Okay, so earlier I mentioned that Canis, in one version of her myth, is said to be the child of a goddess of horses, right? So it kinda makes sense for her to have horse ears since, you know, horses. But what if it's actually connected to Canis' legend as a hero of the Lapith tribe? In case you didn't know, here's a quick rundown. The Lapiths were a human tribe that, according to some legends, had a unique relationship with centaurs. They're often portrayed as opposites in myths, but their origins are actually really similar. Some stories even suggest they were like one big extended family. Now, as a hero of the Lapiths, Canis having those weird ears could be a way to symbolize that connection. It's like a reminder that, yeah, she's human, but she's got strong ties to centaurs. Her aggressive personality also reinforces this idea, which matches how centaurs are often described in myths. So in other words, those aren't horse ears, they're centaur ears. And since centaurs aren't technically animals, it kinda fits. What about Nitocris then? Some people say her ears aren't real and are just a design motif representing the gods and goddesses of Egypt. Honestly, I agree with that. But we can see Nitocris's ears twitching during battle. It's kinda hard to see them as just decoration at that point. So if I were to interpret it, I'd say they're part of the powers granted to her by the Egyptian gods. She's considered a child of Horus and has his abilities, which is why her design includes bird-like features. At the same time, she's connected to underworld powers, which fall under the authority of Anubis, hence the jackal-like ears. And even though Anubis has a jackal head, it doesn't feel right to categorize a god as just an animal, you know? So it'd make more sense if she wasn't included in the animal characteristic trait, since those aren't animal ears, they're Anubis ears. The Queen of Sheba has a legend where she's said to be half human, half jinn, and sometimes her appearance is linked to having donkey-like feet. Some people also say she's a shapeshifter. In her second ascension, she even has goat-like horns. What I'm trying to say is, she decides how she wants to appear. So yeah, her ears aren't animal ears either, they're jinn ears, and jinn definitely aren't animals. Speaking of ears, this reminds me of another character with animal-like ears who doesn't fall under the animal characteristic trait, Suzuka Gozen. For those who don't know, Suzuka's animal ears are fake. She only manifests them to spite Tamamo. But here's the funny thing, we just spent a few minutes talking about how even artificial ears made from fabric by a heroic spirit can still count as an animal trait. And yet, Suzuka doesn't fall under the animal characteristic trait. I honestly can't think of a theory for why that is. Maybe some of you are thinking it's because Suzuka is an Oni. But then again, Benyanma is also an Oni, and she does have the animal characteristic trait because of her bird-like features. So, what do you guys think? Let's shift from talking about ears to something else that's been bugging me: physical transformations. Why is Barghest in the animal characteristic trait category? It's kinda weird because physically, her body doesn't show any animal traits at all. Sure, if you think about her origin as a black dog, a being destined to become a giant, ferocious calamity in dog form, then okay, it makes sense. But I don't see any hint of Barghest actually having animal traits. What I really want to point out is how this compares to Kiyohime. Kiyohime also has a transformation into a snake, which is just as animal as Barghest's backstory. So why is Barghest the only one classified under the animal characteristic trait? I don't get it. Is it because of her horns? Barghest's horns trigger her transformation if they break, but Kiyohime also has horns and, well, here we are. You know who else is pretty popular and widely recognized for transforming, or more accurately, having the form of a humongous flying serpent? Quetz. But Quetz doesn't fall under the animal characteristic trait either. Maybe this ties back to what we discussed earlier, where gods aren't classified under the animal trait, and Quetz in FGO isn't really portrayed as a flying serpent, even though she's clearly connected to that concept. But when we're talking about serpent goddesses, Gorgon is somehow included in this trait. To be fair, Gorgon's design screams snake from top to bottom, with animalistic features all over, but isn't she also a goddess? You get what I mean, right? This whole transformation thing feels kind of weird when it's categorized as an animal characteristic trait. And now we get to the last one, and honestly, the most confusing: Melusine. Why is she in this category? What part of her is even animal? This feels a lot like Barghest's situation, but somehow even more baffling. You know what? Okay, fine. I can kinda tolerate the idea that Barghest's horns might count as part of her animal characteristics, even though we've seen other examples, like Kiyohime, where that doesn't apply. But with Melusine, man, This just doesn't sit right with me. So here's the thing. Melusine's initial appearance looks humane. I honestly don't know what part of her doesn't seem human. Well, maybe just her eyes. They're described as resembling dragon eyes, but that's about it. In her final ascension, though, things change. She starts looking more like a dragon. Her legs turn black and clawed, her hands do the same, and parts of her face become covered in black scales. Yeah, that's definitely non-human. But the problem is, does that really count as an animal characteristic? Remember, Melusine originally comes from a fragment of the dragon Albion. She later transforms into a fairy and takes on a human-like form. At the end of her story, she reverts to her dragon form and loses her sanity. She is somewhat dragon. Does that mean dragons are considered animals? If dragons are included as animals, then wouldn't every character with a dragon trait also fit this category? Like, take Elizabeth, for example. That girl even has a freaking tail. Now, of course, there's a possibility. It might not be the dragon part that puts her in the animal characteristic trait. Maybe it's the fairy aspect instead, since she is a fairy. But if that's the case, then shouldn't Oberon, Sith, and Morgan be included too? Honestly, I've got no clue on this one. What do you guys think? Anyone else you can think of who has this kind of issue? Not that I'm really complaining about this minor trait or anything, but hey, this channel's all about discussing these little weird things, right? I just enjoy talking about stuff like this. Don't forget to subscribe, guys. See you in the next video.